Hello, everyone. Welcome to Genealogy Adventures. I'm Brian Sheffy, and
And and I'm Donya Williams. How are you today?
listen, season eight, virtual high five.
What? Yes. Hey now. We
So,
are happy about that one.
congratulations for 8 years. It's been a journey.
8 years.
It's been a wonderful partnership.
It has. It has. I think you know what? I think we're gonna have to start like really planning out 10 already. Like we need to start now because
Abs-
it's exciting.
Absolutely. And guys, we really missed you during our hiatus, even though we both really needed to recharge our batteries and kind of get on with other parts of our lives. But we're so excited to be back.
Yes, we are. We are. And we have some good shows that's coming up for you guys too. We got some good show ideas. Now we're still in the midst of getting them together, getting them out there and everything. But let's get started on this one
Yes,
because this one went viral.
it did. But I just want to quickly say shout out to everyone in the path of Helene from Florida to, did you see those crazy pictures of Asheville, North
My God, my family. God bless you guys. I am praying
Carolina?
for you. I'm keeping you all in my prayers. We are consistently praying for you guys and hoping for the best for every last one of you in Georgia,
Yes.
Florida, South Carolina, North Carolina. Brian, I'm so glad you are okay. Florida really got hit really bad.
Mm,
Greenwood was real bad,
it was.
and Aiken everywhere. So we are keeping you guys. Helene, she just did her thing, and she was not playing. She started out weak and came back strong. So
You did.
yeah,
So you're all in our thoughts. As Don
yes.
said, we have an action-packed show today, so I'm going to get straight into the introductions. We are so pleased to welcome Charles Holman III to the show. Charles has been a genealogist for more than half a century. Genetic genealogist C.C. Moore from the show Finding Your Roots has called Charles a pioneer amongst Black Americans researching their family ties to before the Civil War. A 19-year-old graduate of the University of Michigan at the age of 22, Charles became one of the youngest lawyers in the history of Michigan. His choice of law as a profession was rooted in the path chosen by his maternal great-grandfather, a formerly enslaved man who became one of the first lawyers of color in his state. As an assistant U.S. attorney, Charles won national recognition from the U.S. Attorney General and the director of the FBI for successfully prosecuting persons who burned Black churches in the South. Charles also served as a trial attorney at both the U.S. Department of Justice Civil Rights Division and the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. In these positions, he achieved victories for minorities, women, and older individuals denied public accommodation housing and jobs due to race, age, or gender discrimination. Later, as head of a civil rights agency, he set records for achieving the most in total settlements for discrimination victims in the agency's history. Charles' work in civil rights has been fueled by his interest in uncovering his ancestors' lives in early America. He views himself as standing on the shoulders of those who came before him. He has reunited with long lost cousins whose families were separated from his due to slavery. He has met white cousins who descend from those who enslaved his Black ancestors. This past summer, the Washington Post featured Charles in a front page article, and it was an amazing article. Please do track it down. That's the Washington Post, which highlighted his groundbreaking research, which proved that before his paternal great great grandfather became a conductor on the Underground Railroad, he and his family had been enslaved by the ancestors of President Bush. Charles is a member of the National Genealogical Society, the Sons and Daughters of the Middle Passage, and the Sons of the American Revolution. And with that said, welcome to the show, Charles.
Thank you. It is a pleasure to be here, and I appreciate both of you for giving me this opportunity.
Well, you have not one, not two, you have quite a few just really genuinely fascinating family stories to tell.
Thank you.
And to start things off, I just wanted to get a general understanding of What led you to family history, and what led you to doing genealogical research?
Well, it was like a lot of kids. In school, we get those assignments to find out where our people came from. But, for me, it was the late 1960s, a real turbulent year. Martin Luther King being assassinated, and then Bobby Kennedy. And it seemed like everything was in turmoil. But the school teacher asked us to find out where our people had come from. I had no idea. So I went home like most kids and asked my mother, where did our folks come from? And my mother was from Detroit, and she had relatives from the South, but she was born in Michigan. She'd never gone down there, never met most of them, and she had no ties to her past. And so she really didn't know the answer to that. And her parents were both dead at that point. And she told me, well, we're American Negroes and we come from Africa. Okay, well, next question, where in Africa? She had no idea. So the next day in school, the teacher was asking us what we'd learned. I was the only black kid in the class. And, those kids in those days gave you pure H if you were black in a white setting. And, you spend all this time trying to fit in and all, but I couldn't with this assignment because while these other kids had all this history to share, I had nothing. So I came back and I told my folks again, told my father and my stepdad, and they were of the mind that we're going to get you that history. It's there. And they began to speak to my grandparents' siblings who were still living, whose parents had been enslaved people. And my father took me to see his parents. And my grandfather was also the son of two enslaved people. And they told me some, but the grandmother, who was from Canada, was the one who really told me the most. Because her family, like a lot of black families in southern Ontario, Canada, they are very much aware of how they got from the United States to Canada and why they, were there. So she told me a little bit, but because I was young, there was a lot she didn't tell me because there's certain things that are hard for, an adult to share with a child, which I was at the time, especially as it involved slavery. So that kind of set in motion the whole thing. And over the course of the next 50 years, I've spent decades trying to learn that history. But when DNA became available for the first time, autosomal DNA, especially through Ancestry DNA, it provided the framework for huge discoveries that followed. So that was kind of the starting point. And I would tell anybody that's getting started with this, you really need to seek out those old people in your family, the oldest people there, and get them to talk to you and take a tape recorder or a video camera and get as much as you can. And then go back, do it again and again, and sit down with them and go through their photos. Because some of these people who were enslaved, who have so much to teach us, pictures of them exist. And the only reason that a lot of us haven't seen them is we haven't asked the right people in our families to share those pictures.
That is true. That is true.
Mm.
So before I get to the first actual family member that we're going to talk about, I'm just curious, in the course of doing your research, going to repositories and kind of beginning to understand the records you needed to find to tell your family story, did you find that it was really helpful coming from a legal background? Were there any transferable skills that you brought from that training to being a genealogist?
Well, there were a lot of skills. And first I have to say, I'm not a property lawyer. So I'm not a lawyer that specializes in wills and trust. And that's a lot of what you need to use to do genealogical work. But for me, I am a civil rights lawyer, and I have made my living most of my career in handling discrimination cases. So, the skills that were involved with that, questioning people and looking at evidence were very, very helpful. But the other part of it is that if you want to do civil rights law, the genesis of discrimination in America is slavery. So you need to understand where it all began in this country and why it occurred and how it affected your people through the generations and how it affects us today. And it became a really good background so that when, the young woman comes to me and tells me that, she has been there all these years and has all these beautiful evaluations, but they would never consider her for a management slot. You understand what's going on, and you know the right questions to ask. And you know that people with that kind of track record, they're not just making it up. This is real, and what she's faced with is the same thing that we're all faced with from time to time. And when you really get down to it, employment discrimination has direct links to slavery because that was all about employing people to make people who owned the land wealthy. So it's been real helpful, but it's kind of become a mission because the genealogy work complements my career work and vice versa.
True, because I would imagine you have an entire historical kind of backdrop to draw on. So presumably, when you were in school, you read about and you learned about the Underground Railroad, and what was it like actually finding out that you had ancestors who were connected to
Well,
that?
it was fascinating because I learned in the course of that my grandmother, whose grandparents escaped from slavery in Kentucky to Canada, she had been telling my father and his siblings the stories about their escape from when they were very small children. But they had forgotten a lot of it. So when I began to question her and she began to tell me, how they planned this escape, how their biggest obstacle was the Ohio River between Kentucky, where they were enslaved, and the North, how Quakers disguised my grandmother's grandmother to make her look like a white woman who was, mourning the death of someone in her family, with a black dress and a veil over her face so you couldn't really see, her features, and a sunbonnet over her hair to disguise that she didn't have hair like a white person. Her hair was, curly, but it wasn't like, you would expect from most Caucasians. And then about how when they got to the Ohio River, the Quakers had arranged for a boatman to take them across. And before they do anything, the Quakers insisted that my great great grandfather and my great great grandmother get married. So they married them right there during the course of their escape
Oh,
at the
wow.
Ohio River. And then, once they got across the river, my great great grandmother was put on a train for the North. And my great great grandfather, being more brown skinned like me, they couldn't pass him off as a white person. That's something I've never attempted to do for obvious reasons. So he had to walk. And my grandmother told us about, places where the Quakers told him he could stop for refreshment, for rest, and, and then resume the journey. And then both of them got to Michigan. They were reunited and then taken across the river into Canada. But the part that my grandmother really didn't tell me that I found most fascinating was that after both of them became free in Canada, they kept going back to Kentucky and they kept rescuing and helping other people to escape. And the obvious question was, well, if you're free, why are you going to jeopardize it by going back into harm's way? But then there came a time, and this was years after my grandmother was deceased, and there was a very, very elderly relative at that time who we all called Aunt Mattie. And I was telling this story, I thought I knew all the stuff, and I'm, thinking I'm some great historian or whatever. And Aunt Mattie very softly came over to me with her cane, and she put her hand, or free hand, on my wrist, and she said, "I know that story." And she said, "The reason that your great great grandmother kept going back is she had had a child by the slaveholder before she was able to escape, and she was
Mm.
sexually abused by him." And that's what motivated the two of them to get on out of there. And she said that the my great great grandmother kept going back because when she escaped, she had to leave that child, her firstborn child, by the slaveholder behind. And she could not bear to live without that child. So she risked life and limb going back to try to get him. And she even enlisted my great great grandfather to do so. And his advantage was one of his enslavers' daughter had taught him to read and write, because it wasn't illegal in Kentucky to teach an enslaved person to read and write, as it was in other states where it was
Mhm.
illegal, and you could get into a lot of trouble by doing that. But she had taken a liking to him, and I guess she thought of him as her pet or whatever. And so both of them kept going back. But the sad thing is, she never was able to get him because each time she'd go back, the slaveholder had moved him, or they thought maybe had sold him, and she couldn't find him. So after I learned that story, it upset me because I could not imagine being separated from a small child of mine. I couldn't imagine the pain that that would cause. And I remember going to her gravesite in Canada, where she was buried in 1902, and just speaking out loud to the grave, "I'm so sorry that what you went through and that you could never find this child again." And, of course, when you're talking to a grave, nothing's going to speak back to you. You look like a crazy person. But I felt this feeling of peace, this feeling like it was all right. There was no need to be sorry or sad that it had worked out. And I couldn't really make sense of that. And I went to a spiritual friend of mine and I told her about it. And she said, "Well, Charles, maybe the child that she was separated from in life, she's
She got
reunited
back
with
with
in
him in
death."
death. Yeah,
But
I mean, you
I gotta
said you're
tell
looking
you
crazy.
something.
Yeah, you say you're looking crazy and speaking back, and they spoke back to you. That's what that peace was that you were
Amen.
feeling. You weren't. It's not crazy, Charles. It's
You're
that's
right.
what that piece. That's what that piece was. They're gonna talk back to you, and you're
Yes.
gonna get, especially at a cemetery when you're going there. They want you to visit. They want you to say what you want to say, because that's that moment where you're finally able to like get it out and say
Yes.
what you need to do and get what you need to say out, and that's the best place to vent.
I
That's
agree.
like,
I think you know this better than I do, and I have to agree with everything you just said. But I'll be honest with you, Danya, I didn't go there intending to speak to no tombstone. I just wanted to
no,
find
and you
her,
don't you don't
you know.
realize it until you get there, and you're like, I think the first time I spoke to a tombstone when my cousin Camille died, and I was angry, angry, angry at her, and I just just blurted every feeling that I had, everything. And some things came back to me where
Yeah.
some things just, she just let me go. She just let me go. And she was like, I get it. And
Yeah.
it gave me a sense of calm
Yes.
after the fact. So, and that's what you got, that sense of
Yes.
calm where you were like feeling a certain way. So they're going to talk back to you, even if you
Yeah.
get a certain piece that you wasn't expecting. I
I
mean, I
wasn't
personally
expecting
feel
it.
like, yeah,
And
you're not going to expect it. Cemeteries will give you a type of peace that you will never ever understand.
well, she
And that's them
did.
calming you.
And,
Yeah.
I can't say that it cured me of all of these feelings I had about what had happened to her. I mean, to be sexually assaulted by some white slaveholder and then having to leave your child and then him doing everything he could to keep you from getting the child. I mean, I still had
Hmm.
a lot of rage inside me, to be
Well,
Of
honest with you.
course.
because this is where I want to jump in, because there's two things that you said that have really resonated with me, and one of these may be me, making two and two equal five instead of four, but wasn't hearing from you that the enslaver who raped your ancestor was keeping the child because he loved that child or he recognized that child as his, because you're saying she didn't know where that baby was.
She didn't
He
know.
wasn't on the property. Even the assumption that that child may have been sold, it didn't sound as though there was any paternal feelings towards that child. Um, he sounded as though he was bitter and resentful and
He
hateful.
was mad that he lost his quote unquote property. But
So,
I'll be honest with you, Brian, I really have not researched that slaveholder like I want to because
mhm.
there was so much more to the story. And the thing that I learned later as a result of DNA and mining my DNA matches, and I could tell you a little bit how I did that. But as a result of that, I found a cousin who was related to me through my great great grandmother's sister, who she'd left behind when she escaped. And my grandmother never told me anything about her family. That was not the story that was passed down. The story was only about her escape. But when I found this relative who matched me and other people that I had strategically DNA tested in my family, so I could identify which of the grandparents and great grandparents we had in common, when I looked at her at Ancestry, her family tree was incomplete. So I went to work on it and I found that her ancestor had the same surname as my great great grandmother who escaped. And in researching the sister, I learned who the slaveholder was of both of them. And then when I looked at that slaveholder's records, I found both of them in his estate inventory, my great great grandmother and her sister. So, finding her was the key. And then I connected with the slaveholders' white descendants. And that's a whole nother story. They gave me a tour of the plantation and they were wonderful. But the part of the story I
And
want to
you'll
share with,
probably, as you go further into it, you'll probably find the son. That's
well, that's
probably
what
the
I want
piece.
to tell you about.
Yeah,
I
that's the
found
piece that
him.
she gave you.
Oh,
I
Uh-huh.
found him. And this DNA match was key to it because after the Civil War, when they were all free, he went to live with the sister in Louisville,
oh
ran
wow.
her
Mhm.
family. And then as I got into it more, there were records of the Freedmen's Bureau that told how he was one of the first black school teachers in Louisville. And, then it began to take on a whole nother thing that even though this child probably felt abandoned, that he was able to reconnect with my great great grandmother's family. And his identity was African American, although his appearance, because his father was a slaveholder and his mother was light enough to pass, he looked Caucasian, but his commitment was to his people. So finding that and knowing that she'd reconnected with the son in freedom was another reason that helped explain to me why I felt that peace at her gravesite, because it had all
That's
been
right.
settled.
You ain't even have to tell me. I
You
got
know,
it. I knew it right off the
they
break. Oh, she found
knew
them
and you
already.
knew because you asked the question, but I didn't know. But his life was interesting because he spent the first part of his life in slavery teaching black kids. But then he had difficulties. His wife and him separated, his daughter died, and he decided that he wanted to leave. And so he started buying property from the United States government through the Homestead Act program. And he was buying land in Colorado. And his dream was to become a rancher out there. But let me tell you, a black rancher in that part of Colorado was somebody who was going to have a real hard time. So he went out there under the guise of, letting people assume what they wanted to by his appearance. And he didn't tell them what his real identity was. And, they liked him. They didn't realize that he was someone they should be prejudiced against because that's the way they were to our people. They elected him as the justice of the peace, and he was, marrying their kids and helping others to establish their homesteads. And I got to just make this little commercial break right quick. Bernice Bennett is one of the most fantastic African American genealogists alive today. I don't think she begins to get the kudos that she should get. She was the one who taught me about his homestead acts and about what happened to him when he went to Colorado. And interestingly, when he died, on his death certificate, he didn't mention either of his parents because some white person he knew in Colorado who was the informant on the death certificate. But they did know that his father was of English descent and that his mother lived in Canada. She did.
Wow.
And then he had them ship the body back to Louisville, which is where he was buried.
You
But
know,
that's a story that I focused on for a lot of years. And it caused me to not really put the focus on my great great grandmother's husband, my great great grandfather, Robert Anderson Thomas. And, there's another really fantastic African American genealogist named Shannon Crispus. And Shannon will really keep you up to date on the latest, especially when it comes to DNA. But one year, Shannon told us, he said, I want you to pick out a branch of your family you're going to focus on in this coming year. And so I did it. And as I began to focus on that great great grandfather who escaped, and you have his picture, Danya, great great grandfather Robert Anderson Thomas. And actually, the picture I gave you is one that was taken many years later after his escape. But yeah, that's him. This picture was taken when he was probably in his, I'd say probably early 40s, and he escaped when he was about 19. And this picture was taken in Canada some years later. But he was the one I began to focus on next.
but
Who were his
before we
people?
move on to him, because
Yeah,
there's just a couple of things I just want to stay with. So the kind of shame of the ancestor who became a homesteader in Colorado is, and it's kind of the disgrace of this country, really, is
yes,
he got accepted because of an assumption. He was still the same
yes,
person. He would have been the same person if he had openly lived his life as an African American man.
yes.
Because he presented him, his physical appearance presented itself as other. He was welcomed into that community.
He
But
was
what I'm saying
welcomed.
really badly is he was still him. he was still the person he was. He conducted himself in the way he would have conducted himself anyway. And I guess, and that's true today. People make assumptions and then they cast, they give you characteristics based on what they think you are. And I
You're
just,
not allowed to be who you are.
exactly.
You're judged by some ridiculous concept of race instead of who you are as a person
Mhm.
and what you have contributed.
The other thing that I wanted to point out was because I'm not sure if all of our audience kind of understands what you said. So the fact that the lady, your ancestor who went to Canada, her skin tone was light enough for her to pass as white. That took a couple of generations, and she was enslaved. I can't
Oh,
say that
yes.
she was enslaved. The young, her child who ended up going to Colorado was born enslaved. Nobody freed them.
No.
That was the result of multiple generations of enslavers having children by enslaved women, who it sounds like were the results of white enslavers having children with their enslaved women. She wouldn't have looked that way if this hadn't happened to her line over multiple generations.
Absolutely. And she was only 14 when she gave birth to him. He
Wow.
was raped basically as a child by a much older man and who did nothing but cause hardships in her life. So, you know, it's hard to have any good feelings about that. And, one interesting aside is once the son got to Colorado, he had a disagreement with the white man there. And the white man tried to take his horse, and he shot the white man and wounded him. Now, the neighbors all vouched for him, and there was a trial, and he was acquitted because it was self-defense.
Hmm.
But imagine what the result would have been had they known he was a black man
Mm.
He
shooting
would have
a
been
white
hung
man for
immediately.
trying to take his horse.
He would have been
So
hung immediately.
you hate the fact that somebody isn't able to live as who they are. He's a black man. He should be able to live as a black man. And I don't like the thought of people, you know, pretending they are something that they're not completely. But I understand it. I don't condone what he did, but I understand it. And I realize that that's what enabled him to survive. But I want to go back, if I can, to this ancestor, Robert
Mhm.
Anderson Thomas, who's on the screen. I knew about his life, but again, I didn't know anything about where he came from or the people that enslaved him. It was all a mystery, except that one of the slaveholders' daughters taught him to read and write. That's all I knew. But I went back to DNA, and I had a match on the side of my family who he's from. And she was right here in the Washington, D.C. area. She's a younger person. And I reached out to her and I said, "You are related to me through these ancestors who escaped to Canada from slavery." And she didn't know anything about it because, she lived here in D.C. She's born and raised. And, her mother's from here. Her grandmother was a relative of Mayor Bowser, who's the mayor of Washington, D.C. She didn't know they had roots anywhere outside of the Washington area. But I told her all this, and she was smart because she went to her great grandmother who was still living. And she said, there's this guy trying to say we came from Canada and all this and all that. And her great grandmother said, "It's true." And not only that, she pulled out a picture of my grandparents when they had come to visit her in Washington in the early 1960s. So, and from
Mm.
that, I met her great grandmother who died last year at the age of 105. And we were going through her pictures, and lo and behold, this picture that's before you of my great great grandfather, she had it. And it was an old tin picture. It wasn't on paper, it was on metal. and it was in surprisingly good, condition. And she even had the photographer's frame around it, which told who the photographer was and his studio.
I
And
can tell you was the photographer Addison Scurlock.
I wish I could remember his name. I can get it for you. But he was a white
It's
man.
probably him.
He was a white man from Massachusetts, and then he
Oh, okay,
came
then it was him.
west, and he took a lot of pictures of people in Ontario, Canada, and parts of Michigan. So,
It wasn't Addison. Okay.
but I saw his picture for the first time, and it made me realize, you really got to figure out, who this man was and where he came from and all. So again, I went back to the DNA matches. And I found another DNA match on that same side of the family. And it turns out that DNA match was matching all my cousins on that side of the family. So I looked at their family trees. They didn't go back very far. Nobody had the same last name as him. And so I started working on the family tree of the one who had the most down. And I saw she had an ancestor who originally came from Kentucky. None of the rest of them were from Kentucky. So I started working on that family tree. And I saw, okay, she is a widow of a Civil War soldier. You need to get that Civil War widow's pension file because that's going to tell you who her family was, and by extension, who your great great grandfather's family is. And it's also going to tell you who the slaveholder is. So, the pandemic was going on, you couldn't get nothing. So again, I said, I got to see what connections I got. And again, Bernice Bennett, I'm telling you, she is fantastic. She arranged to go down to the National Archives, and she called me from the National Archives when she found the file. And she said, Charles, you are not going to believe this, but I have a picture of your great great grandfather's sister's husband in uniform. That's the next picture I gave you, Danya. And I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe that there would be a picture and it would be in the file. But the files also told that their family was enslaved by this family whose last name was Forey, that they lived just outside of Louisville. And then she told who her parents' names were. And the names of her parents matched up exactly with the names of my great great grandfather's parents, which I'd gotten from the Freedmen's Bureau bank records. So I knew I had the family. And then she went on to talk about how this guy in the picture was the blacksmith for the family that enslaved them. And she told that originally her husband and her had come from Kentucky, and she had been taken from her parents when she was only 6 by the person who enslaved her in Missouri, which is where they were taken. And when she was very, very young, she married this guy, and the slaveholder married them both right in his house. And she talked about what they had gone through in slavery. But then there came a point where the slaveholder decided to cash out, to sell all the enslaved people and move from his farm in rural Missouri to St. Louis. And he sold this man here in the picture, and he sold my great 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 aunt as well. And they ended up being owned by some Confederate people. And the Civil War got worse and worse. And then they were transferred to a man who was a general in the Confederacy. He had been the governor of Missouri, and, like the Bushes today, their ancestors were very well connected in antebellum times, too. And this general decided to take them from Missouri to Texas because the Civil War was beginning to end and the Confederacy was losing. And frankly, I think he was afraid that he might be hung as a traitor because he was a Confederate at war against the Union Army. Anyway, this guy, about a year or so before all that happened, escaped and ran and joined the Union Army. So he was sent away as a soldier in the Union Army. This Confederate guy that ends up owning them both decides he's going to go to Texas, takes his wife to Texas, and when this guy gets out of the service, he goes back to Missouri looking for his wife, and she's gone. So he writes to people in Texas. He can't find her. They don't know where she went. She was writing back, had someone write a letter for her back to Missouri, trying to find out if this guy had come back. And she was told erroneously that he had died in the war. So her and her brother left Texas, went to Louisiana, started all over again. They left the town of Marshall, Texas, which is where this Confederate general dropped them off, and they walked to the nearest good-sized city, which was Shreveport, Louisiana. And she evidently missed her husband and mourned the fact that he died in the war and that she'd been separated from him. And she met another Civil War soldier, Black Civil War soldier. And they hit it off, they married, and their family moved back to Texas while he pursued his military career, and at some point one of the Dakotas, and then eventually to New Mexico and Arizona. But those Civil War soldier files were critical. And then the last thing that I had to research was, okay, I got the name of these slaveholders now.
Well, I just want to again jump in. Sorry.
Yeah, because I have some. I'm confused
Yeah,
too.
Okay.
Brian, you might get ready to say something that we probably on the same level.
Well, it's just an observation, and then by all means ask your question. The thing that I love about these are two amazing photographs, because again, it's so rare that we get photographs of our ancestors, especially
Right.
coming out of slavery in this time period. But what strikes me about the two photographs that we've just seen for the two men, when you look at their eyes, they've seen some stuff.
Oh, yes.
Both men had haunted eyes. And that's just one of the things. That's just one of the. They're proud men, but yeah, you could tell they had some experiences. But that was it.
Well, this guy was wounded several times in the Civil War, and after the war ended, he couldn't immediately go back to Missouri to his family because he was recuperating in Texas from these wounds. And I think that's how him and his wife ended up being like ships passing in the night, that they could never make the connection with each other because she's looking for him thinking he's home, and he's not. He's recuperating in Texas, and he's thinking she's in Missouri, and she's not, and she's moved on with her life in Louisiana. But yes, you look
So
at
let
his
me ask you
eyes.
this. But let me ask you. So are you saying this man fought on both sides?
No, he was a Union soldier, and he was sent to Brownsville, Texas, and he fought in one of the last battles of the Civil War, which actually was a defeat for the Union side forces, and that's where he
Oh,
was
I thought
pretty
you were
badly
saying he.
wounded.
Oh,
Okay,
no. I think
I
I think
thought you said
I think I know where the
he fought on
confusion
both
came in.
sides.
I think I know where the confusion came in. His previous enslaver doesn't sound like he was a Confederate or wanted anything to do with the Civil War. He just sold all of his enslaved people and
The
left.
first, yes, he
The
sold all the
second,
people.
Oh, okay, okay.
it was the second enslaver who was the Confederate, and this gentleman was like, "I ain't about that life." Joined
That's
the
right.
Union, joined the
That's right.
Union, and did what he had to do.
And what I
Got
like
it.
about these two men in these photos is my great great grandfather escaped in 1854, and he helped other people escape to Canada. But this man who's on the screen now in 1863 took a different route. He fought to free our people by service in the Union Army. And because of his wounds, that resulted in his Civil War pension file. which described what had happened to him, how he got wounded, and so forth. But I want to backtrack a bit. After learning this, I wanted to know more about these original slaveholders who took my great great grandfather's sister and gave her to one of his children who took her from her parents to Missouri. And I wanted to know about what was going on in my great great grandfather's family. Who were the other siblings? So I had the slaveholders' name now. And I went to a historical library in Louisville, Kentucky, in the same county where they were enslaved. And this place, if you haven't been there, it is amazing. It's called the Filson Historical Society. And they had a family file on the slaveholders' family. And there was a real nice lady working there. Her name was Hannah. And she helped me get these records. She even emailed me more records after I left there. And it was like, whatever you want, if we got it, we're going to give it to you. And they did. And I'm reading through this file and I'm learning about the slaveholder. And then I get to a file which has a newspaper article in it from the 1990s. And suddenly it tells me this family, they are the ancestors of President Bush. And here I am thinking, the Bushes were from New England and then, in modern times went down to Texas and made their money from oil and all this and all that. Some of that is true. But the first President Bush, his mother, Dorothy Walker Bush, her mother was from Missouri. And her mother's family are the family that enslaved this guy on the screen and my great 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 aunt. And the slaveholder in that instance, his wife's father, is the one that originally enslaved all of them back in Kentucky. So then I wanted to say, okay, let me see if I can find this plantation in Kentucky. Maybe I can get a feeling from the land or something about my ancestors. There it is. And this place was really unusual. The area where it was located had been farmland, but in the years afterwards became a very, very affluent suburb. And the people that bought the farm or plantation where my people were enslaved, the original home of the slaveholder was still standing. It's a log house, which is at the center of that picture. And because Kentucky is a state that takes historic preservation more seriously than some of the other states, they wouldn't let them tear that cabin down. So what these wealthy people did was they maintained the original house and they built other structures that connected to it. So I was able to find this place. The current owner of it was not real hospitable, didn't even want to meet me, but at least he was willing to give me permission to get on the phone, to get on the property and see it. So having gotten all this, I thought, okay, you got to contact the Bushes because they may have even more records. And the sad truth is, our people were considered property. So the records of our people that still exist are oftentimes the property records or are mentioned in the journals and diaries of the families who enslaved them. So I reached out to President Bush. I wrote him twice. And not hearing from him, I wrote to his daughter, Jenna Bush Hager, wrote to her twice, didn't hear from her either. I said, okay, well, let me try Jeb Bush. He looks like he's pretty liberal. And
you weren't going to hear from him. I'm sorry.
Well, see, you again, you know more than I know. Because I don't know Florida. I'm from Michigan. So I wrote to him and then he blew me off like, yesterday's, leftovers. So then I said, okay, what about Laura Bush? She's on the Museum Council of the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. I wrote to that beautiful lady, and again, I got the same response. They blew me off too. So then I got to thinking, there must be another way to get to these people. I don't want money from them. I'm not seeking reparations in the form of dollars. I'm seeking reparations in terms of learning my history, which you are holding captive. So I thought, let's try another way. And the final thing I tried was, if I'm a nobody, then I need to get a hold of somebody who speaks with a much louder voice than me, who can get past staff people and get to these bushes and help me to get what I want. So I went to a reporter for the Washington Post. And let me tell you, they were anxious to get the story. And the lady who ended up being assigned to the story worked with me for almost a whole year. And I told her, I said, I don't think there's any sense in you trying to reach the bushes because they're going to do the same thing to you as they did to me. And she said, well, I want to at least give them that chance. So she tried multiple times before she wrote her story to try to get a hold of them. And just like with me, they blew her off too. Now, I have a cousin who I asked to try to connect with them, and she went through some roundabout sources and was able to get the chief of staff directly. And he sent her a very politely worded letter saying, we don't have the records, we can't help you. But again, the Bush family never bothered to respond. And there's a group called Coming to the Table.
Mm-hmm.
And, they do some very interesting work trying to unite the descendants of enslaved people with the descendants of enslavers. And they gave like a 27-point list of things that the descendants of enslavers should do if they're contacted by the descendants of people their ancestors enslaved. And one of the things they put on here was, in their advice to the slaveholders' descendants, when you get a letter from the descendant of enslaved people, always respond. Always. African American researchers may contact you, and as a descendant of an enslaver, commit yourself to respond to all of those inquiries, even if you don't have the information. One of the most hurtful things that descendants of enslavers can do to African American researchers is disregard their inquiries. And then they went on to say that even if you don't have any records, descendants of enslavers, you may be able to get through to your relatives and others who have the records, who will give them to you, but may not give them to me as a descendant of enslaved people. But for whatever reason, I never heard from the Bushes. Maybe one day I will. But in the meantime, I'm going to carry on. And I'm going to learn more and more and more, and nothing and no one is going to stop me. And I don't want
I have one
I don't
question.
want money. I want knowledge.
I have one question for you from the audience, and I think everybody in the audience wants to know this one question. Are you writing a book about all of this?
Well, Danya, I am writing 3 books at the same time. And there's one that I've been working on for decades. And the subject matter was so complicated that it's taken me to become an old man. I'm 66 to really be able to understand it. And it's taken me, to have been a federal prosecutor, to have prosecuted crimes, to be able to understand that family story, which is about, an enslaved relative who in Reconstruction was a sharecropper for his former enslaver. And the sharecropping arrangement went bust, and he couldn't get his money. And the two fought, and the slaveholder ended up dead. And that's the story I want to tell first. The other stories, God willing, I'll get to them in time if I have enough time.
Well,
Well,
thank you so much for, I mean, really, I can't even believe that the hour, we're basically at the end of the
Where'd
hour.
it go?
But thank you so much for, it's just been riveting. There's just been
Thank you.
such a wealth of storytelling and facts and history and emotions in this. And just thank you for being so open and for talking about your ancestral journeys.
Thank you for having me. It is an honor to be here with both of you and to be able to tell the stories. So I'm grateful.
So, other than that, I just wanted to. We didn't even get a chance to kind of go into the different kinds of resources that you use because you had to go and access a lot of records to tell this story.
Yes.
And just again to remind our researching audience, not everything is online. Many records that you need have never been digitized. You have to go to brick and mortar places to get
Yes.
them, which is one of the things that Charles did. That was a big part of his research.
I did put that down. Somebody else just asked that same question, and I told him he could go to Fold 3 because he asked about getting Civil War records. And I told him you can go to fold3.com, but you can you got to go to the National Archives. Sometimes you just got to get up and go to the National Archives and just go straight there and get those records and things of that nature. But yeah, this is a great story, and I thank you so much
Can I
for
add just
being
one
on the
little thing
show
right
and just
quick?
start.
I just quickly, I
Yes.
want to say that we have people who are doing this research, like you and Brian. And people, you need to get a hold of these experts because people like me at this age, they weren't always around and they can
Hmm.
cut through a lot of this stuff and hypercharge your research. And you will find out things that blow your mind.
Thank you
Yes,
for
you're
that. And
absolutely right. Thank you for that.
I couldn't agree more. Donnie and I always openly acknowledge the Black genealogists that inspired us and who, whether directly or indirectly, taught us how to do it.
Yes. Yes. And Bernice is one of my teachers.
She
So
Yes.
is superb. And Angela
she is
Walton
one of
Raji,
my
too. She is
well,
tremendous.
I didn't work with her, but I've never worked with Angela, but Bernice is one of my direct teachers. So
Yeah, all
but we
those
are
instructors out of Maji, they're all tremendous.
Yes.
yeah, we are definitely out of time though. Thank you guys so
And
much for
Renee,
joining us for season
Renee,
8.
she is good too.
Yes, yes.
Renee.
Thank you all for joining us for season 8. We have a great show, great time in store for you guys. So we will see you. Stick with us because we are here. Charles, don't hang up.
Okay.
So we'll see you as always next Sunday, 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time in all the usual places. And until then, enjoy the rest of your Sunday. I'm Brian Shepherd.
Remember,